I never thought I'd be sitting alone in our Victorian home at 85 years old, watching my husband of 65 years pack his bags for another woman. Walter looked me straight in the eye that morning and said, "Ellie, I've been faithful for 6 decades. That's long enough." Then he told me he was leaving for Judith Pearson, his high school sweetheart before I came along. The woman who'd been widowed just 6 months earlier and had apparently reached out to reconnect. That same afternoon, Walter emptied our joint accounts of nearly $2 million and left his wedding ring on the nightstand. 65 years of marriage, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and all of it meant nothing the moment Judy batted her eyelashes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But what Walter forgot about, what he never bothered to remember, was that special clause buried on page 7 of our prenuptial agreement. The clause my father had insisted upon, the one Walter signed without a second glance because he was too busy trying to impress my family. "If you're going to marry into timber money," my father had said, "I need to know my daughter will never suffer for it." Little did any of us know how crucial those carefully chosen words would become more than half a century later. And now, Walter thinks he's walking away with everything, heading for his sunset years with his high school flame. But the lawyers have already been called, the paperwork has been filed, and my husband is about to learn that betrayal at 87 doesn't come without consequences. I still remember the day I met Walter Mitchell. It was the summer of 1958, and Mapleton was hosting its annual Founders' Day celebration down by the harbor. I was 19, home from my first year at college, wearing a blue dress my mother insisted brought out my eyes. Martha, my older sister, had dragged me along despite my protests that I had reading to catch up on. "You can't spend your whole summer with your nose in those accounting books," she'd insisted. "Besides, the Mitchell boy is back from the service. Everyone says he's going places." I had no interest in the Mitchell boy or any boy that summer. I had plans, big ones. I was one of only 7 women in the business program at my university, and I was determined to prove I belonged there. My father had built Collins Timber from nothing, and while my brother was the presumed heir, I intended to carve out my own place in the company. But then Walter appeared at the lemonade stand, tall and confident in his dress uniform. When he smiled at me, something inside me shifted. He wasn't like the other young men in Mapleton. There was no family money behind him, no connections to leverage, just ambition, intelligence, and a determination that matched my own. "Eleanor Collins," he said, extending his hand instead of making small talk about the weather like everyone else. "I hear you're studying business. I want to start my own someday. Maybe you could teach me a thing or two." 6 months later, we were engaged. My father was hesitant. The Mitchells were respectable, but certainly not in our social circle. Walter's father worked at the paper mill, and his mother took in sewing. But I was in love with his drive, his dreams, and the way he looked at me like I was the smartest person in any room. "If you insist on marrying him," my father had said one evening in his study, cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling, "then we'll need some protections in place. Collins' money stays with Collins' blood." I didn't argue. I understood business, and marriage was the most important partnership I'd ever enter. The prenuptial agreement was thick with legalese, and Walter bristled at first. "Doesn't your father trust me?" he asked, hurt evident in his eyes. "It's not about trust," I explained. "It's about prudence. Would you go into business without clear terms?" Walter signed it without reading every page. "I don't need your family's money," he said proudly. "I'll build something of my own. You'll see." And he did. With a loan from my father, that Walter insisted on repaying in full, he opened Mitchell's Hardware on Main Street. One store became 2, then 5 across the county, then 15 throughout the state. By our 10th anniversary, Walter had created a regional chain that rivaled the bigger national brands. I gave up my own ambitions to support his. When Robert was born in 1960, followed by Patricia 2 years later, I embraced motherhood while keeping Walter's books in the evening. As the business grew, I managed our household, raised our children, hosted dinners for potential investors, and edited every business plan Walter drafted at our kitchen table. "We're partners," Walter would say, kissing my forehead as I balanced the monthly accounts. "None of this would be possible without you, Ellie." When Walter wanted to expand beyond New England in the 1980s, I spent months researching potential markets while also caring for my ailing parents. When my father passed and left me a substantial inheritance, I invested every penny in Walter's vision. The Mitchell Hardware headquarters in downtown Mapleton employed over 100 people, and Walter's face beamed from the company newsletter each month. "My wife is the secret to my success," he told the Chamber of Commerce when they named him Business Leader of the Year in 1992. "Ellie believed in me when I was just a poor boy with big dreams. For 65 years, I stood by his side. I nursed him through pneumonia in '79, a heart attack in '98, and a hip replacement in 2010. I managed our investments, planned our retirement, and created trust funds for our grandchildren. Our life together wasn't perfect. No marriage is, but it was solid, or so I thought." Last spring, Walter started attending his high school reunion committee meetings. I thought nothing of it. At our age, connecting with old friends seemed natural. Mortality becomes more real with each passing year, and nostalgia is a powerful comfort. "Judy Pearson is on the committee," he mentioned casually one evening. "Remember her? She married David Reynolds right after graduation." I did remember. Judith had been Walter's girlfriend through most of high school, a pretty girl with auburn hair who'd written passionate notes in his yearbook. They'd broken up when Walter enlisted, and he'd met me the summer after his return. "David passed 6 months ago," Walter continued, his tone too deliberately casual. "Cancer. She's having a hard time, apparently." I expressed my sympathies and thought little more about it. Walter and I were in our 80s, well past the age of jealousy or insecurity. We'd built a life together, weathered every storm side by side. There was nothing to fear from a widow seeking comfort in old friends. How wrong I was. Walter began coming home later from committee meetings. He bought new cologne. He started taking longer walks alone, for his heart health, he claimed. And then came the text messages that made his phone chime at odd hours. He'd glance at the screen and smile before excusing himself to answer. Grace, my oldest friend, noticed the change during our weekly bridge game at the country club. "Walter, seems different lately," she remarked carefully, arranging her cards. "More energetic." I brushed off her concern. "The reunion planning is good for him. Gives him purpose since he retired." Grace gave me a look I chose to ignore. At 85, I didn't want to entertain the possibility that my husband might be slipping away. We were past all that, or should have been. Then came that fateful morning 3 months ago. Walter sat across from me at our breakfast table, the same table where we'd shared meals for decades, and cleared his throat. "Ellie, we need to talk," he said, setting down his coffee cup with a determination I recognized from his business dealings. "I've made a decision." I waited, a piece of toast halfway to my mouth, as Walter explained that he'd reconnected deeply with Judith, that they'd realized they still had feelings for each other, that at their age they didn't want to waste whatever time they had left. "I care for you deeply," he said, as if that softened the blow. "You've been an excellent wife and mother, but Judy and we have unfinished business. I need to see where this leads before it's too late." The toast turned to ash in my mouth. 65 years of marriage, and you're leaving me for unfinished business? Walter had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I've consulted with Andrew," he said, referring to his lawyer. The house is in both our names, so we'll need to sell it and divide the proceeds. The brokerage accounts are joint property. I've already withdrawn my share to secure a new place. My hands trembled. Your share? You mean the money I helped you earn? The accounts I managed while you built your business? You'll be provided for, Walter said, his tone suddenly businesslike. Andrew says that since we married so long ago, and most of our assets were acquired during the marriage, they're considered marital property, regardless of who earned them. I stared at this stranger across the table, this man who was reducing our lifetime together to an accounting problem. And the prenup? I asked quietly. Walter waved his hand dismissively. Ancient history. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was a simple document protecting your family's timber assets, which we sold decades ago. Andrew says it's essentially meaningless now. That afternoon, after Walter left with his suitcases, I sat alone in our parlor, the same room where we'd celebrated Christmas mornings, where we'd mourned my parents, where our grandchildren had played at our feet. 65 years of memories, and Walter had walked away from them all for a high school infatuation. The numbness lasted until evening. Then, as the reality of my situation sank in, something hardened inside me. I hadn't studied accounting and business all those years ago for nothing. I hadn't managed our finances for decades without learning a thing or two about contracts and fine print. With hands that no longer shook, I climbed the stairs to Walter's study and unlocked the fireproof safe hidden behind his collection of business books. Inside, beneath decades of tax returns and property deeds, lay a leather portfolio containing our original marriage documents. I spread the yellowed pages across Walter's desk and began to read. There, on page 7, was the clause my father had insisted upon, the one Walter had dismissed as standard boilerplate, the one neither of us had thought about in 65 years. In the event that either party dissolves the marriage through abandonment, infidelity, or willful desertion, all assets previously joined shall revert to the injured party, regardless of origin or contribution. My father, ever the shrewd businessman, had protected me in ways I'd never anticipated needing. The prenup hadn't just safeguarded the Collins timber fortune, it had created a safety net for a future none of us could have imagined. I picked up the phone and called Daniel Harrington, the son of my father's original attorney, and now the head of his own firm. Daniel, I said when he answered, I need your help. I believe my husband has made a very costly mistake. The next morning, I sat in Daniel's office as he reviewed the prenuptial agreement with growing amazement. Mrs. Mitchell, this clause is extraordinary, he said, adjusting his reading glasses. It's broadly worded but legally binding. Your father was quite forward-thinking for 1959. Is it enforceable? I asked. After all this time? Daniel nodded slowly. Prenuptial agreements don't expire unless they contain specific sunset provisions. This one doesn't. And Mr. Mitchell's actions, emptying joint accounts, moving in with another woman, constitute clear abandonment under the terms defined here. Hope flickered inside me. So what does this mean, practically speaking? It means, Daniel said, leaning forward, that Walter has inadvertently triggered a clause that entitles you to everything. The house, the brokerage accounts, his pension, even his shares in Mitchell Hardware, which, although he's retired, still generate substantial dividends. I sat back, stunned. Everything? Everything, Daniel confirmed. Your father created a prenup that was ahead of its time. Most agreements of that era only protected premarital assets. This one contains penalty clauses for misconduct that apply to all marital property as well. I thought of Walter, so confident that his lawyer had everything figured out, so certain that at worst we'd split our assets down the middle. What? About Walter's new condo? I asked. The one he purchased with the money from our joint accounts? Daniel smiled grimly. If he used marital funds to buy it, and we can prove those funds were improperly removed after he decided to leave the marriage, then legally, that property could be yours as well. As I left Daniel's office, I felt no triumph, only a profound sadness mingled with determination. I hadn't asked for this fight. I hadn't wanted the final chapter of my life to involve lawyers and asset recovery. But Walter had made his choice, and now we would both live with the consequences. That evening, I received a call from Patricia, our daughter. "Mom," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Dad just told us about Judith. I can't believe he's doing this to you after all these years." "How did Robert take it?" I asked, thinking of our son who had always idolized his father. Patricia sighed. "He's in shock. We all are. Dad's trying to spin it as some grand romance, saying life is too short. And he deserves happiness." "And what do you think?" I asked carefully. "I think," Patricia said firmly, "that you deserved better than this. You gave up your career for him. You built that business alongside him. You managed everything so he could pursue his dreams." Her loyalty warmed my heart, but I didn't want to place our children in the middle. "Your father made his choice," I said simply. "Now I'm making mine." After we hung up, I walked through the empty house, touching familiar objects. The grandfather clock Walter had given me for our 25th anniversary, the photo albums chronicling our life together, the quilt my mother had made for our marriage, bed. 6.5 decades of shared history, and Walter had discarded it all for a fantasy from his youth. I poured myself a small glass of sherry, my one indulgence each evening, and settled into my favorite chair by the window. Outside, Mapleton continued as it always had. Neighbors walked their dogs. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. The world hadn't stopped, even if mine had temporarily tilted on its axis. As I sipped my sherry, I realized something important. I was experiencing grief, yes, but not desperation. At 85, I had lived through my parents' deaths, watched friends succumb to age and illness, and buried a grandchild taken too soon by a drunk driver. I had survived heartbreaks before. I would survive this one too. Moreover, I wasn't without resources. I had my health, my mind, our children's support, and now, thanks to my father's foresight, I would have financial security as well. The next day, I visited First Atlantic Community Bank, where the manager, a woman younger than my granddaughter, listened sympathetically to my situation. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm so sorry about your husband's actions," she said. "Unfortunately, he was an authorized user on your joint accounts, so the withdrawals were technically legal. However, we can certainly help you secure what remains." I left with new accounts in my name only, passwords Walter would never guess, and a credit card that had nothing to do with our shared financial past. Small steps toward independence I'd never expected to need at this stage of life. That evening, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Reverend Davies on my porch, his expression grave. "Eleanor," he said gently, "Walter came to see me this morning. He asked me to speak with you, to help you understand his situation." I invited him in, offered tea which he declined, and listened as this man 30 years my junior attempted to explain the workings of the human heart. "Walter feels this connection with Judith is a gift," the Reverend said carefully. "A chance to experience joy in his final years. He hopes you can find it in your heart to forgive him and approach the dissolution of your marriage with Christian charity." I set down my teacup and looked directly at Reverend Davies. "Did Walter mention that he emptied our joint accounts before telling me he was leaving? Did he share that his lawyer assured him I'd have no claim to the business I helped him build?" The Reverend shifted uncomfortably. "He mentioned there were financial matters to resolve." "I see," I said, rising slowly from my chair. "Then please deliver a message to my husband. Tell him I've consulted my own lawyer about those financial matters. Tell him I expect a full accounting of every penny he removed from our joint holdings. And tell him," I paused, choosing my words carefully, "that my father taught me never to sign a contract I hadn't read thoroughly. A lesson Walter apparently never learned." After the Reverend left, I called Daniel. "I'm ready," I told him. "File whatever paperwork you need to. It's time Walter understood exactly what he's walked away from." 2 days later, Walter received formal notice of my intent to enforce the prenuptial agreement. Within hours, he was at the door, his face flushed with anger. "What is this?" he demanded, waving the legal documents at me. "Some kind of joke?" I invited him into the home that would soon legally be mine alone. "It's the prenuptial agreement you signed in 1959, I said calmly. "Page 7, paragraph 4. Perhaps you should read it this time." Walter snatched the document, fumbling for his reading glasses. I watched his expression change as he absorbed the implications of those carefully worded sentences. "This can't be enforceable," he spluttered. "It's been 65 years. "Daniel assures me it is," I replied. "Your lawyer should have found it during due diligence. That's what you pay him for, isn't it?" Walter's face paled. "Ellie, be reasonable. This would leave me with nothing." "Not nothing," I corrected him. "You'll have exactly what you chose, Judith." He tried another approach. "Think of our children, our grandchildren. What will they say when you take everything from their father?" The appeal to family, from the man who had just fractured ours, ignited something in me. "Our children?" I repeated, my voice steady, but cold. "The ones who watched me support you for 65 years. Who saw me manage the household, the finances, your social calendar, and your health affairs while you took all the credit. Those children?" Walter's shoulders sagged. For the first time, uncertainty clouded his eyes. "What do you want, Ellie?" "I want what's legally mine," I answered simply. "Every asset we built together, the assets you thought you could divide, up like leftover pie, taking the bigger piece for yourself and your new life." Walter left defeated, but I knew better than to consider this settled. He hadn't built a hardware empire without tenacity. This was only the opening salvo in what might become a protracted battle. That night, Grace came over with a bottle of wine and a lifetime of friendship. "He always was a fool," she said as we sat in the kitchen. "Handsome, charismatic, but a fool nonetheless." I smiled faintly. "I loved him, Grace. For 65 years, I truly loved him." "I know you did," she said, reaching for my hand. "That's what makes this so unforgivable." We sat in companionable silence, two widows of a sort, Grace through death, me through desertion. Then she asked the question I'd been contemplating myself. "What will you do, Ellie, after all this is settled?" I looked around the kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of family meals, where I'd helped our children with homework, where I'd managed household accounts and, later, our retirement plans. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but for the first time in 6 decades, I'll get to decide for myself." As Grace left, she hugged me tightly. "You're stronger than you think, Eleanor Mitchell. Always have been." After she drove away, I climbed the stairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Walter since Eisenhower was president. I opened my jewelry box and removed my wedding ring, a modest diamond that had seemed enormous to a young bride in 1959. I held it in my palm, feeling its familiar weight. Then I placed it in the drawer of my nightstand, next to the ring Walter had left behind. 2 circles of gold, no longer connected, a fitting symbol for what we had become. The next morning, I awoke with purpose. Walter had taken my past, but he wouldn't take my future, however many years I had left. I dressed carefully, fixed my hair, and drove myself to Daniel's office for our scheduled meeting. "We've received a response from Mr. Mitchell's attorney. Daniel informed me as I settled into the chair across from his desk. They're contesting the validity of the prenuptial agreement based on its age and what they're calling unreasonable penalty provisions. I nodded, unsurprised. And your assessment? They're grasping at straws, Daniel said confidently. The law is clear. Your father's attorney drafted an ironclad agreement. Unless there's some document we're unaware of, a codicil or amendment that nullified these provisions, Walter has no legal ground to stand on. There is no such document, I assured him. What happens next? Daniel leaned forward. We proceed with the asset recovery process. It may take time, but eventually, the courts will enforce the terms of the agreement. I thought about the months ahead, the legal filings, the potential court appearances, the inevitable gossip in our small community. At 85, this wasn't how I'd envisioned spending my remaining years. But as I left Daniel's office, something unexpected happened. For the first time since Walter's betrayal, I felt a flicker of excitement about the future. Not because I would reclaim our financial assets, although that justice was important, but because I was finally steering my own course. For 65 years, my life had been defined by my role as Walter's wife. His ambitions had become mine. His schedule had dictated our days. His preferences had shaped our home, our social circle, our retirement. Now, standing on the sunlit sidewalk of downtown Mapleton, I realized I had been given an unexpected gift. The chance to rediscover Eleanor Collins, the young woman who had once had dreams of her own. The morning after my meeting with Daniel, I woke to the sound of car doors slamming in my driveway. I peered through the bedroom curtains to see Robert's sedan parked behind Patricia's SUV. My children had arrived together, unannounced. This wasn't going to be a casual visit. I dressed quickly, ran a brush through my silver hair, and made my way downstairs. By the time I reached the kitchen, Patricia had already put on a pot of coffee, and Robert was arranging pastries from Brennan's bakery on the good china, the wedding gift from Walter's parents that we'd used only for special occasions. "Mom," Patricia said, wrapping me in a hug that felt somehow protective. At 63, my daughter still moved with the energy that had made her captain of the swim team in high school. "We didn't want to call ahead in case you said not to come." Robert approached more cautiously. My son had Walter's height and build, but my cautious temperament. At 65, his hair had long since gone gray, and the responsibilities of running Mitchell Hardware had etched permanent worry lines around his eyes. "Dad called us both last night," he said without preamble. "He's in a state." I settled into my usual chair at the kitchen table. "I imagine he is." Patricia poured coffee for all of us, her movements brisk and efficient. "He claims you're trying to take everything from him, that you've dug up some ancient document and are using it to punish him." I stirred a teaspoon of sugar into my coffee. "I'm enforcing a legal agreement your father signed willingly before our marriage. An agreement he chose not to read carefully at the time." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, he's 87 years old. If you take everything, where will he go? What will he do?" The question stung, not because it was unfair, but because it revealed where my son's concerns truly lay. Not with the 85-year-old mother who'd been abandoned, but with the father who'd done the abandoning. "Your father has made his choice," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He chose Judith Pearson over our marriage. He chose to empty our joint accounts without discussion. He chose to walk away from 65 years together without a backward glance. Now he's facing the consequences of those choices." Patricia reached for my hand. "Mom, we're not defending what Dad did. It's indefensible. We just worry that if this gets ugly, it will hurt everyone, including you." I looked at my daughter, this strong woman who'd navigated her own difficult marriage and come out the other side. "Patricia, what would you have done if Thomas had emptied your accounts and moved in with an old girlfriend?" She didn't hesitate. "I'd have taken him to the cleaners, but that was different. I was younger with children to support. And I'm old, so I should just accept being discarded? I asked softly. Accept that the life we built together means nothing the moment a more exciting option appears? Robert cleared his throat. No one's saying that, Mom. We just want to find a reasonable solution. Maybe a settlement that gives you security without leaving Dad destitute. I considered my son the peacemaker, always looking for middle ground, for the compromise that would keep everyone calm. It had made him an excellent businessman, but sometimes prevented him from seeing situations clearly. Robert, your father consulted his lawyer before making any decisions. He believed, and was apparently advised, that at worst we would split everything 50-50. He was willing to accept that outcome when he thought it was the worst-case scenario. The fact that the actual consequences are more severe doesn't make his actions any less calculated. Patricia's expression hardened. Wait, Dad talked to Andrew before telling you he was leaving? He planned this? I nodded. According to Walter himself, he sought legal advice about our assets before informing me of his decision to end our marriage. Robert looked ill. That doesn't sound like Dad. But it did. That was exactly Walter. Thorough, strategic, always 3 steps ahead in any negotiation. It was what had made him successful in business and, apparently, in planning his exit from our marriage. I'm not trying to turn you against your father, I said gently. He's still the man who taught you to fish, who built Mitchell Hardware from nothing, who loved you both fiercely. But he made a choice, and that choice had terms. Attached to it 65 years ago, terms he accepted. My children exchanged glances, a silent communication that excluded me. Finally, Robert sighed. We'll talk to him, he said. Try to make him understand that this situation requires a reasonable solution. In the meantime, is there anything you need? What did I need? The question was both simple and impossibly complex. I needed the past 3 months erased. I needed my husband to have been the man I thought he was. I needed 65 years of marriage to amount to more than a discarded obligation, but I said only, I'm fine for now. Daniel is handling the legal aspects, and I have enough in my personal account for immediate expenses. After they left, promising to return soon, I wandered through the empty house. Photographs lined the hallway. Our wedding day, the children's. Graduations, family vacations, our 50th anniversary cruise. A documented life that now felt like elaborate fiction. I paused at a picture from 1983, Walter receiving the Chamber of Commerce Award, his arm around my waist, both of us beaming. The local newspaper had quoted him praising me as the secret to his success. Had that been genuine gratitude or merely the expected public acknowledgement of a supportive wife? The telephone rang, interrupting my thoughts. I answered to hear Grace's concerned voice. Ellie, are you sitting down? I've just come from the country club. I sank into the nearest chair. What happened? Walter was there for lunch. Grace said, her voice tight with indignation. With Judith. They were holding hands across the table like teenagers. And Ellie, she was wearing a diamond ring, a big one. The room seemed to tilt slightly. He's engaged? Apparently, Grace confirmed. Linda Peterson stopped by their table, and Judith made quite a show of flashing it around. Said they're planning a small ceremony next month. Just family and close friends. Family, our children, our grandchildren. Would they attend this ceremony celebrating the relationship that had destroyed our marriage? There's more, Grace continued reluctantly. Walter was telling Harold Freeman that he's restructuring some assets due to his new situation. Harold asked if that meant selling his Mitchell Hardware shares, and Walter said he might have to, depending on how unreasonable you decide to be. My fingers tightened around the receiver, the business shares. Of course, Walter would use those as leverage. He knew how much I valued the company we'd built together, how proud I was of its place in the community. The thought of those shares being sold to outside investors, the Mitchell name potentially disappearing from the stores, would be calculated to pressure me. "Thank you for telling me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "What are you going to do?" Grace asked. I thought about Walter and Judith, planning their new life together, making decisions about our shared assets as if they were his alone to distribute. "Exactly what my lawyer advises," I replied, "and not one bit less." After hanging up, I called Daniel immediately and relayed what Grace had told me. "He can't sell those shares," Daniel assured me. "We've already filed for an emergency injunction, preventing the disposal of marital assets pending resolution of the prenuptial enforcement. If he attempts to sell the Mitchell hardware stock, he'll be in contempt of court." Relief washed over me. "Thank you." "Mrs. Mitchell," Daniel said, carefully, "there's something else you should know. We've been investigating the withdrawals from your joint accounts, and we've discovered that some transfers began almost 6 months ago. Small amounts at first, then increasingly larger sums. 6 months. Half a year of secretly siphoning funds while sleeping beside me each night. While celebrating our 65th anniversary, while planning his escape. Can we recover those funds?" I asked, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "We're working on it," Daniel said. "But Mrs. Mitchell, Eleanor, you need to prepare for the possibility that this might get considerably worse before it gets better. Mr. Mitchell appears to be liquidating assets wherever possible, likely in anticipation of the prenup being enforced." After the call ended, I sat motionless in Walter's study, surrounded by the books and awards that chronicled his business success. Success I had contributed to in countless ways, often unseen and unacknowledged. I had believed we were partners, in every sense. Now I understood we had been playing entirely different games. The doorbell chimed, pulling me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone else today, and part of me wanted to ignore it. But decades of social training, a proper "lady always answers the door," propelled me to my feet. I opened the door to find Judith Pearson standing on my porch. Time had been kind to her. At 84, she was still slim, her auburn hair now a carefully maintained silver white, her makeup tastefully applied. She wore an expensive-looking cashmere sweater and wool slacks, and on her left hand gleamed the diamond Grace had described, ostentatious, far larger than the modest ring Walter had given me all those years ago. "Eleanor," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hope I'm not intruding." 65 years of social training warred with the urge to slam the door in her face. Manners won. "Judith, this is unexpected." She gestured vaguely. "May I come in? I think we should talk, woman to woman." I hesitated, then stepped aside. If nothing else, this conversation might provide insight into Walter's plans. Of course. I led her into the living room, deliberately choosing the chair that had always been Walter's, leaving her the sofa where visitors typically sat. A small power play, but it gave me some satisfaction to see her perch uncomfortably on the edge of the cushion. "Can I offer you anything?" I asked, politeness a shield against the surreality of this moment. "No, thank you," she replied. "I won't stay long. I just thought we should clear the air." I folded my hands in my lap, waiting. This was her show, after all. Judith smoothed her slacks, her diamond catching the light. "Eleanor, I want you to know I never intended to cause you pain." Walter and I reconnected innocently at first, just old friends reminiscing. But sometimes life gives you a second chance at first love. The practiced speech, delivered with rehearsed sincerity, made my stomach turn. "How fortunate for you, both." She pressed on, undeterred. "Walter tells me you're being difficult about the financial arrangements. I thought perhaps if we spoke directly, woman to woman, we might find a more amicable path forward." amicable, I repeated. You're engaged to my husband of 65 years, wearing what I suspect is a ring purchased with funds from our joint accounts, and you've come to my home to suggest I should be more amicable? Judith's smile tightened. The situation is what it is, Eleanor. Walter has made his choice. Dragging this out through the courts won't change that. It will only drain resources that could otherwise provide for both of you in your remaining years. The calculated practicality of it, as if we were discussing a business transaction rather than the demolition of my life, ignited something inside me. Tell me, Judith, I said, keeping my voice conversational. When did Walter first contact you? Was it before or after David passed away? A flicker of something, discomfort, perhaps guilt, crossed her face. I don't see how that's relevant. Indulge me. She sighed theatrically. If you must know, Walter reached out after seeing David's obituary in the paper. He sent a condolence card. It was a kind gesture from an old friend, nothing more. And when did the kindness evolve into something that warranted emptying joint bank accounts and planning a wedding? I asked, still maintaining my pleasant tone. Judith's facade cracked slightly. I don't know what Walter has told you about our financial discussions, but I assure you, I never asked him for anything. Whatever arrangements he's made have been his decision entirely. Of course, I agreed. Walter has always been decisive. It's one of his most admirable qualities. Though I'm curious, has he told you about our prenuptial agreement? The slight widening of her eyes told me everything. He mentioned there was an old document your lawyer has dredged up, some technicality that won't hold up in court. I smiled faintly. Did he happen to mention what that technicality entails? That in the event of abandonment or infidelity, all marital assets revert to the injured party? That would be me, Judith? She dismissed this with a wave of her bejeweled hand. Ancient history. No court will uphold something signed before man walked on the moon. Daniel Harrington disagrees, I said mildly. As will the judge, I suspect. The law is quite clear on this point. Valid contracts don't expire simply because they're inconvenient. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Judith's face. Walter says it will be resolved. I'm sure he does, I replied. Walter has always been optimistic. It's another of his admirable qualities. Judith's composure was slipping. This wasn't going according to whatever script she and Walter had prepared. What do you want, Eleanor? She asked bluntly. Is this about money or revenge? I considered the question seriously. Neither, actually. This is about consequences. Walter made vows, legal and moral commitments, that he chose to break. The prenuptial agreement simply defines what happens as a result of that choice. So you'll take everything? She challenged. Leave him with nothing at the end of his life? Is that the legacy you want? The question struck deeper than she knew. Legacy. What would mine be? The dutiful wife? The vindictive ex? The cautionary tale? My legacy, I said slowly, will be determined by far more than how I respond to being abandoned at 85. But it will certainly include standing up for myself when necessary. Judith stood abruptly. I can see this conversation is pointless. You're determined to punish Walter, regardless of who else gets hurt in the process. I remained seated, refusing to be rushed by her theatrical exit. I didn't invite this situation, Judith. Walter created it, with your willing participation. Whatever happens next is the natural outcome of those choices. At the door, she turned back, her expression hardening. You know, Walter always said you were cold underneath that perfect housewife exterior. Too practical to understand real passion. I see now what he meant. The barb was designed to wound, to make me question every moment of my marriage. Had Walter really said such things? Had he always seen me that way? But as the door closed behind Judith, I realized it didn't matter. Whatever Walter had said, whatever he truly believed, couldn't change the reality of our 65 years together. It couldn't erase the life we'd built, the family we'd raised, the business we'd grown. And it certainly couldn't change what was about to happen next. 3 days later, Robert called. His voice was strained, almost unrecognizable. "Mom, have you spoken to Dad's lawyer?" "Only through Daniel," I replied. "Why?" Robert exhaled heavily. "Dad just called me from Andrew's office. They've received the formal notice about the asset freeze. He can't access any accounts, can't sell any properties or stocks, can't even use his credit cards. Everything's locked until the court makes a ruling." I had known this was coming. Daniel had explained the process, but hearing it confirmed made it suddenly, brutally real. "I see," I said carefully. "And how is your father taking this development?" "How do you think?" Robert snapped, then immediately apologized. "I'm sorry, Mom. It's just, he's falling apart. He didn't understand what that prenup really meant. He thought at worst it would be a 50-50 split." "He should have read it more carefully," I said, unable to summon sympathy for Walter's predicament, "or consulted with Andrew before making irreversible decisions." "That's just it," Robert said. "Andrew never saw the original prenup. Dad told him it was a standard agreement protecting your family's timber assets. Since those were sold decades ago, Andrew assumed the prenup was essentially irrelevant. The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, yet it did. How could Walter have been so careless with something so important? Had he truly believed the document signed at the beginning of our marriage had no bearing on its end? "What does your father expect me to do now?" I asked. Robert hesitated. "He wants to talk. Face to face. No lawyers. He says there has to be a reasonable solution that doesn't involve destroying everything he's built." Everything he's built. Not everything we've built. The distinction wasn't lost on me. "I'll consider it," I said finally. "But I'm not making any promises." After hanging up, I poured myself a rare midday sherry and carried it to the sun porch that overlooked my garden. The roses Walter had meticulously tended each spring were dormant now, their branches bare against the November sky. Would I agree to meet with him? What purpose would it serve, beyond giving him an opportunity to manipulate me as he had so many business opponents over the years? Walter had always been persuasive, had always known exactly which emotional buttons to push to achieve his desired outcome. Yet refusing to meet would only reinforce the narrative he was surely crafting, that I was vindictive, unreasonable, determined to destroy him out of spite. That narrative would spread through our social circle, perhaps even to our children and grandchildren. Did I want to spend my remaining years cast as the villain in Walter's tragic romance? I was still pondering this question when the doorbell rang again. This time, I found Martha, my sister, on the porch. At 87, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her expression was as fierce as ever. "I just ran into Judith Pearson at the pharmacy," she announced, brushing past me into the hallway, wearing a rock the size of Delaware and telling anyone who'd listen about their spring wedding plans. The nerve of that woman. I led Martha to the kitchen, where I put on the kettle for tea. "So I've heard." Martha eased herself into a chair, her arthritis making the movement deliberate. "Grace called me, told me everything. Why didn't you call me yourself, Ellie? Finding out my baby sister's husband has lost his mind shouldn't come through the grapevine." I set out the teacups, our mother's bone china that Martha had insisted I take after the funeral. "I didn't want to worry you." "Your heart?" "Oh, please," Martha interrupted. "My heart is fine. It's my pride that's wounded, finding out about this mess third hand. Now sit down and tell me exactly what that fool has done and what you intend to do about it." Over tea, I recounted everything. Walter's departure, the emptied accounts, the prenuptial agreement, the impending legal battle. Martha listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly thunderous. And now, Robert wants you to meet with Walter, she summarized when I finished. To find a reasonable solution, as if walking out on his wife of 65 years could ever be reasonable. I sighed. I don't know what to do, Martha. If I refuse to meet, I look petty and vindictive. If I agree, I risk being manipulated into concessions I don't want to make. Martha set down her teacup with a decisive click. Then don't meet him alone. Have Daniel present, or me, or both. Don't give Walter the opportunity to work his charm without witnesses. The suggestion had merit. Walter was at his most persuasive in one-on-one settings, where he could tailor his approach to his audience without interference. I'll think about it, I promised. Martha reached across the table to cover my hand with hers. Do you remember what Father used to say about negotiations? I smiled faintly. Always know your walk-away position. Exactly, Martha nodded. What's yours, Ellie? What's the absolute minimum you'll accept to end this cleanly? It was the question I'd been avoiding, not because I didn't know the answer, but because acknowledging it meant finally accepting that my marriage was truly, irrevocably over. I want the house, I said slowly, and enough income to maintain it for the rest of my life. The Mitchell. Hardware shares, not because I want to run the business, but because they should stay in the family for Robert and the grandchildren. And, I hesitated, then continued, acknowledgement. I want Walter to publicly recognize my contributions to everything we built together. Martha nodded approvingly. Good. That's reasonable and specific. Stick to those terms no matter what Walter says or how he tries to make you feel. After Martha left, promising to return the next day, I called Daniel and told him I was willing to meet with Walter, but only with appropriate safeguards in place. I'm glad to hear that, Mrs. Mitchell, Daniel said. A negotiated settlement would be less costly and time-consuming than prolonged litigation. But I must caution you, based on Mr. Mitchell's actions thus far, I'm not confident he's approaching this in good faith. Neither am I admitted. That's why I want you present for any meeting, and I'd like to hold it on neutral ground. Not here, not your office, and certainly not anywhere Walter suggests. We settled on the private dining room at the Mapleton Inn, a local landmark known for its discretion. Daniel would make the arrangements and contact Walter's lawyer with the details. That evening, as I prepared for bed in the room that still held too many reminders of Walter, my phone rang. I answered, to hear Patricia's voice, uncharacteristically hesitant. Mom, I just wanted you to know. Dad asked us to attend his wedding. Robert and me, and the grandchildren. The pain was swift and sharp, like a physical blow. I see. I told him it was inappropriate, Patricia continued quickly, that asking us to celebrate while he's in the middle of legally dismantling. His marriage to you was incredibly insensitive. Relief mingled with gratitude. Thank you, Patricia. Robert's having a harder time with it, she admitted. Dad played the I'm 87. This might be my last chance at happiness card. You know how Robert hates conflict. I did know. My peacekeeping son, always trying to accommodate everyone, even when their demands were fundamentally incompatible. Your brother needs to make his own decision, I said, though the thought of Robert attending Walter and Judith's wedding created a hollow feeling in my chest. I won't put either of you in the middle more than you already are. Patricia made a sound of frustration. That's just it, Mom. Dad's the one putting us in the middle, not you. He's the one who blew everything up and now expects everyone to pretend it's normal, to celebrate even. After we hung up, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror as I removed my makeup. The face looking back at me was lined with 85 years of living, laughing, worrying, crying, loving. A roadmap of a life fully lived. What would the next chapter of that life look like? If the prenuptial agreement was enforced as Daniel expected, I would have financial security for whatever time remained to me. The house would be mine. The Mitchell hardware shares would remain in the family. I would, in material terms, be exactly where I had been before Walter left, except alone. But if I negotiated, settled for less than the prenup provided, what message would that send? That at 85, I valued peace over justice? That Walter could discard 65 years of marriage with only moderate consequences? As I slipped, between sheets that still sometimes felt too empty, I realized that tomorrow's meeting with Walter would determine far more than the division of our material assets. It would establish the terms not just of our divorce, but of my remaining years, whether I would spend them as Eleanor Mitchell, a woman who stood up for herself when it mattered most, or as Walter's ex-wife, the woman who faded into the background of his grand new romance. The choice, for the first time in 65 years, was entirely mine. The Mapleton Inn stood at the center of town, a stately colonial structure that had witnessed generations of local history. I arrived 15 minutes, early for the meeting with Walter, giving the valet my keys and walking through the polished lobby with deliberate calm. Several longtime residents nodded in recognition, their eyes lingering a moment too long. News traveled quickly in small towns. Everyone knew why Eleanor Mitchell was meeting her husband at the inn's private dining room. Daniel was already waiting. In the antechamber, his briefcase open on a side table as he reviewed documents. "Mrs. Mitchell," he greeted me standing. "How are you feeling today?" "Prepared," I replied, which was more accurate than fine would have been. Daniel nodded approvingly. "I've outlined our position clearly. The prenuptial agreement is valid and enforceable. Mr. Mitchell's actions constitute abandonment under its terms. The law is on our side." "And if Walter offers a settlement?" I asked. "We'll listen," Daniel said. "But remember your bottom line. Don't let emotion override your interests." The door opened, and Andrew Covington entered, followed by Walter. Andrew was decades younger than his client, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most Mapleton residents earned in a month. Walter looked smaller somehow, his normally perfect posture slightly stooped, his face drawn. He wore his navy blazer with the gold buttons, the one I'd given him for our 60th anniversary. Our eyes met briefly before he looked away. Had I expected remorse? Shame? Whatever emotion had flickered across his face, it was gone too quickly to identify. The maitre d' guided us to a round table set for 4. Water had been poured, bread placed in the center. The banality of the setting struck me as absurd, discussing the dissolution of 65 years over linen napkins and crystal glasses. After an uncomfortable silence, Andrew took control. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. My client hopes we can reach an amicable resolution without prolonged litigation." Daniel set his legal pad on the table. "We're certainly open to reasonable proposals." Walter cleared his throat. "Ellie, this situation has become unnecessarily adversarial. We were partners for 6.5 decades. Surely we can find a solution that respects what we built together." The familiar voice, the reasonable tone. How many times had I heard Walter use this exact approach in business negotiations? Start with a reminder of shared history, establish common ground, position himself as the rational party. "I agree completely," I said, matching his tone. "Our marriage was a partnership, which makes your unilateral decision to empty our accounts and leave all the more incomprehensible." Walter's jaw tightened. "I took what I believed to be my fair share. 50%. I left the rest for you." "After transferring smaller amounts for 6 months prior," I noted. "Hardly the actions of someone concerned with fairness." Andrew intervened smoothly. "We're not here to relitigate the past. We're looking for a path forward that serves everyone's interests." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "My client's interests were hardly served when Mr. Mitchell abandoned their marriage and removed substantial funds from their joint holdings." The conversation was already deteriorating into legal posturing. I looked directly at Walter, ignoring both attorneys. "What exactly are you proposing?" Walter seemed relieved to address me directly. A clean split. 50-50 on all assets. You keep the house since I won't need it. I keep my personal effects, my car, and half the investments. We each retain our individual retirement accounts. No ongoing entanglements. I considered his offer. On the surface, it might seem reasonable to an outside observer, even generous, with him conceding the house. But our prenuptial agreement entitled me to substantially more. And Mitchell Hardware? I asked. Walter shifted uncomfortably. The business shares would remain with me. I built that company from the ground up. We built it, I corrected. Your vision, my support, your business trips, my management of everything else, your name, our work. Andrew consulted his notes. Mrs. Mitchell has no documented role in Mitchell Hardware operations. She never drew a salary, held no official position, signed no corporate documents. Daniel bristled. That's a deliberately narrow interpretation of contribution. Mrs. Mitchell's support enabled Mr. Mitchell to focus exclusively on business development. She managed their household, raised their children, and handled their personal finances, freeing Mr. Mitchell from those responsibilities. Which was the traditional arrangement for marriages of that era, Andrew countered. That doesn't translate to business ownership. I felt my patience ebbing. If we're discussing tradition, Walter, then perhaps we should also address the traditional view of marriage vows. Until death do us part comes to mind. Walter flushed. That's not fair, Ellie. No, I agreed. None of this is fair, but it is the reality we're dealing with. The waiter appeared, asking if we were ready to order. The intrusion of normalcy into this surreal discussion was jarring. We all declined food, requesting only coffee. When the waiter departed, Daniel redirected the conversation. Let's be clear about the legal position. The prenuptial agreement, signed by both parties in 1959, contains specific provisions for abandonment. Those provisions entitle Mrs. Mitchell to retain all marital assets, regardless of their source or how they were titled. Andrew leaned forward. That agreement was signed in a different era, under different social and legal norms. No court today would enforce such a one-sided penalty clause. Courts routinely uphold contracts signed decades ago, Daniel countered. The passage of time doesn't invalidate a legal document. Andrew turned to me, his expression carefully sympathetic. Mrs. Mitchell, regardless of what your attorney believes the prenup entitles you to, do you truly want to strip your husband of 65 years of everything he's worked for? Is that the legacy you want for your family? The attempted manipulation was so transparent I almost laughed. Instead, I took a sip of water and gathered my thoughts. My legacy, I said evenly, was built over 65 years of partnership with Walter. It includes raising 2 children, supporting a growing business, maintaining our home and social connections, managing our finances, and caring for Walter through multiple health crises. That legacy was secure until 3 months ago, when Walter chose to abandon our marriage, taking substantial funds with him. I turned to look directly at Walter. As for stripping you of everything, that was not my intention when I awoke on the morning you left. It became my legal right when you triggered the terms of an agreement you willingly signed, an agreement your lawyer apparently never bothered to review in its entirety. Walter's expression hardened. So that's it? You'll take everything because some dusty document allows it? 65 years counts for nothing? It counted for nothing when you left, I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. Why should it suddenly matter now? The silence that followed was broken only when the waiter returned with our coffee. We all went through the motions of adding cream or sugar, stirring unnecessarily, avoiding each other's eyes. Finally, Walter set down his spoon with a decisive clink. I want to speak with Eleanor alone. Both attorneys began to object simultaneously, but Walter raised his hand. 10 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Daniel looked at me questioningly. I nodded. 10 minutes. Then we resume with counsel present. The attorneys reluctantly withdrew to the antechamber, leaving Walter and me alone at the table that suddenly seemed too large and too small at the same time. Ellie, Walter began, his voice softer now. This isn't us. Lawyers and demands and prenups. This isn't how our story should end. I stirred my coffee, buying time to steady my emotions. You decided how our story would end the day you left. Walter. Everything happening now is simply the epilogue. I made a mistake, he said, leaning forward. A foolish, impulsive decision that I regret more with each passing day. Hope fluttered briefly in my chest before I recognized the careful ambiguity of his words. Was he saying he regretted leaving me? Or merely that he regretted not securing his financial position more carefully before doing so? Are you saying you want to come home? I asked directly. That you've ended things with Judith? Walter's gaze slipped away from mine. It's complicated. Judith and I have made commitments to each other, but perhaps with time we could find a way to restructure our situation. The flutter of hope died as quickly as it had appeared. You're not offering reconciliation. You're offering to reconsider your options if the financial consequences of leaving become too severe. That's not fair, Walter protested, but his eyes gave him away. We had shared a bed for 65 years. I knew his expressions better than my own. Let me be absolutely clear, I said, setting down my spoon. I am not interested in being your fallback option if your new life proves costlier than anticipated. Our marriage is over. The only question remaining is how we divide what we built together. Walter's expression hardened. If that's your position, then there's nothing more to discuss. You're determined to take everything, regardless of fairness or decency. Fairness? I repeated, a lifetime of suppressed anger suddenly threatening. To break free. Was it fair when you started secretly transferring funds 6 months ago? Was it decent to consult a lawyer about our assets before telling me you were leaving? Did you consider fairness when you removed $2 million from our accounts the same day you walked out? Walter had the grace to look uncomfortable. I took what I believed I was entitled to. Without discussion, without agreement, without a thought for how I would manage in the immediate aftermath. Each sentence came out more clipped than the last as I struggled to maintain my composure. You acted unilaterally then. You have no standing to complain about the consequences now. Walter stared at me as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps he was. The Eleanor he knew had accommodated, compromised, kept the peace for 65 years. That Eleanor might have accepted his 50-50 offer, might have prioritized family harmony over justice. But that Eleanor had disappeared the morning Walter left. In her place sat a woman who had discovered at 85 that she could stand alone. I see, Walter said finally. Then I suppose there's nothing left to say. Just one thing, I replied. The Mitchell Hardware shares will remain in the family. If you truly care about your legacy, you'll ensure that happens regardless of how this legal matter resolves. Walter's eyes narrowed. You'd use the business to punish me? No, I said, rising from my chair. I'd protect it from being casualty in a mess of your creation. Our 10 minutes are up. Shall we call the attorneys back in? The remainder of the meeting was brief and unproductive. Walter rejected any settlement that didn't include him retaining control of Mitchell Hardware. I refused any proposal that didn't acknowledge my entitlement under the prenuptial agreement. We left at an impasse, with both attorneys promising to confer again after consulting with their clients. Outside, the November air was brisk, carrying the promise of snow. Daniel offered to drive me home, but I declined. I need to walk, I said. Clear my head. You did well in there, he assured me. Don't let Mr. Mitchell's attempts at emotional manipulation sway you from your position. I thanked him and started down Maple Street toward the town square. Mapleton in late autumn had a particular beauty. The trees nearly bare, storefronts beginning to display holiday decorations, people hurrying along the sidewalks with purpose. I had walked these streets for over 60 years, first as a young bride, then as a mother pushing a pram, later as a respected business owner's wife. Now I walked them as simply Eleanor Mitchell, a woman alone. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. I had spent my entire adult life defining myself in relation to Walter, his wife, his partner, his support system. Who was I without those roles to anchor me? I paused outside the Seaside Cafe, a relatively new addition to Mapleton's downtown. Through the window, I could see patrons lingering over coffee, working on laptops, engaged in conversation. The atmosphere looked warm, inviting. On impulse, I pushed open the door. The interior was nothing like the formal dining establishments Walter and I had frequented. Mismatched vintage furniture created cozy seating areas. Local artwork hung on exposed brick walls. Behind the counter, a chalkboard listed coffee and tea varieties I'd never heard of. "Welcome to Seaside," a young woman greeted me. "First time visiting us?" I nodded, suddenly self-conscious. The other patrons were decades younger, dressed casually, many absorbed in their electronic devices. "What can I get you?" she asked, with genuine warmth. "Just a regular coffee, please," I replied, reaching for my purse. "First one's on the house for new visitors," she said with a smile. "House policy. Find any seat you like, and I'll bring it over." Touched by the unexpected kindness, I selected a small table near the window. The chair was more comfortable than it appeared, and I found myself relaxing as I watched the pedestrians outside. The young woman brought my coffee in a large ceramic mug painted with sea creatures. "I'm Lily, by the way. I own this place." "Eleanor Mitchell," I replied, extending my hand. "Your cafe is lovely." "Thank you," she beamed. "We're fairly new, just opened last spring. Are you just visiting Mapleton or do you live here?" "I've lived here most of my life," I said. "Since 1959. Lily's eyes widened. "Wow, you must have seen some changes around here." "More than I can count," I agreed, though this building has always been a gathering place. It was Harrison's Hardware when I first moved to town, then Mapleton Books for many years. It was empty when I found it, Lily said. Took months of renovation to get it right. The landlord thought I was crazy to open a cafe when there's already a Starbucks by the highway, but I believed Mapleton needed a place with character. As she spoke about her business, her face animated with passion, I felt a pang of recognition. How long had it been since I'd felt that kind of enthusiasm, that sense of creating something uniquely mine? "Well, I should let you enjoy your coffee," Lily said. "But please come back any time. We have a book club that meets on Thursday evenings. Several. Members are longtime Mapleton residents. They might enjoy your perspective." After she moved away to serve other customers, I sat with my coffee and watched the cafe's rhythm. Young mothers with strollers meeting for conversation, people working remotely, their fingers flying across keyboards. An elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner, occasionally greeting others who passed by. There was a community here that I had never noticed, existing parallel to the country club circuit and charity committees that had defined my social life with Walter. A community based not on wealth or family connections, but on shared interests and genuine interaction. I finished my coffee slowly, reluctant to leave this unexpected pocket of warmth. When I finally rose to go, Lily waved from behind the counter. "Hope to see you at Thursday's book club, Mrs. Mitchell, 7 o'clock. I walked home with a lightness I hadn't felt in months. The meeting with Walter had gone exactly as expected, poorly. Yet somehow, a simple coffee in an unfamiliar cafe had shifted my perspective. Mapleton contained possibilities I had never explored, communities I had never joined, experiences I had never allowed myself. At home, I found a message from Patricia on my answering machine. "Mom, just checking in. Call me when you can." I dialed her number, preparing myself for questions about the meeting with Walter. "How did it go?" she asked immediately upon answering. "About as expected," I replied. "Your father wants half of everything and full control of Mitchell Hardware. I want what the prenuptial agreement entitles me to. We're at an impasse." Patricia sighed. "Dad called Robert already. Said you were being completely unreasonable, refusing any compromise." "Did Robert believe him?" "Robert doesn't know what to believe anymore," Patricia said. "He's torn between loyalty to you and his lifelong admiration of Dad. Plus, there's the business to consider. He's worried about what happens to Mitchell Hardware if this gets ugly." I sank into my favorite chair. "The business shares should stay in the family. I've made that clear to your father, but he seems prepared to sell them to outside investors, if that's what it takes to punish me for enforcing the prenup." "That doesn't sound like Dad," Patricia said, echoing Robert's earlier comment. But it did sound like Walter. The Walter I had glimpsed in flashes over the years, calculating, strategic, willing to leverage whatever advantage came to hand. The Walter who had built a regional business empire from a single hardware store. "People show different faces, in different circumstances," I said finally. "Your father is fighting for what he wants, using whatever tactics he believes will work." After I hung up, I made a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen counter, something Walter would have considered inappropriate. We had always dined at the table, properly set, even when it was just the two of us. Small rebellions, I thought as I rinsed my plate. That's how this new chapter begins. Coffee in unfamiliar cafes, dinner at the counter, book clubs on Thursday, evenings. The next morning, I awoke with unexpected purpose. After dressing with care, I drove to First Atlantic Community Bank and asked to speak with the manager who had helped me secure my new accounts. "Mrs. Mitchell," she greeted me warmly. "How can I assist you today?" "I'd like to discuss investment options," I said. "Specifically, I want to understand my financial position if my prenuptial agreement is fully enforced." She invited me into her office, where she pulled up my accounts on her computer. "Based on the documentation your attorney provided, we've identified these accounts as potentially subject to the agreement's terms." She turned the screen so I could see it. The figure displayed was staggering, nearly $12 million in various investment and retirement accounts, not including the house or Walter's Mitchell Hardware shares. "This reflects all marital assets?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "All that we've been able to identify so far," she confirmed. "Your attorney is still tracing some transfers Mr. Mitchell made in recent months." I had known intellectually that Walter and I had accumulated substantial wealth over our decades together. But seeing the figure quantified was another matter entirely. Even if I received only half of these assets, the settlement Walter was proposing, I would be more than comfortable for whatever years remained to me. But this wasn't just about financial security. It was about justice, about consequences for choices made, about standing up for myself when it mattered most. "I'd like to explore options for managing these assets, assuming they come under my control," I said. "And I'd like to establish a small separate account. Something entirely mine, regardless of how the legal matters resolve." The manager nodded. "Of course. Let me introduce you to our investment advisor." An hour later, I left the bank with a new perspective on my financial situation. I had opened a personal account with funds from the sale of some jewelry Walter had given me over the years, items that were indisputably mine. It wasn't much compared to the millions in question, but it was enough to give me a sense of independence I hadn't felt in decades. As I drove home, I passed the Seaside Cafe. On impulse, I pulled into a parking space and went inside. Lily greeted me with surprised delight. "Mrs. Mitchell, back so soon." "Call me Eleanor, please," I said. And yes, I found myself in the neighborhood. As I settled at the same window table with another perfect cup of coffee, I noticed a "Help Wanted" sign by the register. Part-time assistant manager, weekend hours. The idea that formed was absurd. I was 85 years old, had never worked in food service, had no need for a part-time salary. Yet the notion persisted, taking root as I watched Lily efficiently manage the morning rush. What would it be like to be part of a business again? Not as the silent partner, the supportive wife, but as an active participant. To use my organizational skills, my financial acumen, my people sense in service of something new. When the rush subsided, Lily stopped by my table. "Everything good with your coffee?" "Perfect," I assured her. "I noticed your help wanted sign. What kind of experience are you looking for?" Lily looked surprised by the question. "Ideally, someone with cafe or retail experience, good with people, reliable. Basic bookkeeping skills would be a bonus." She tilted her head. "Do you know someone who might be interested?" I hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Actually, I was considering it myself." Lily blinked, clearly taken aback. "Oh, that's not what I expected." "I have no direct cafe experience," I admitted. "But I managed a household for 65 years, balanced both personal and business accounts, and coordinated countless social events. I raised 2 children, served on multiple committees, and helped my husband build a business from nothing." I smiled. "I'm also extremely reliable." Lily seemed to be processing this unexpected application. "The hours can be challenging. Early mornings, weekends." "I'm an early riser," I replied, "and my social calendar is currently in flux." That seemed a more dignified description than non-existent since my husband left me for his high school sweetheart. "May I ask why you're interested?" Lily inquired, her tone gentle rather than challenging. "Most people your age are enjoying retirement." The question deserved a thoughtful answer. "My circumstances have changed recently," I said carefully. "I find myself with time on my hands and a desire to be useful, to connect with a different part of the community than I've known before." I met her gaze directly. "And to discover who Eleanor Mitchell is when she's standing on her own." Understanding dawned in Lily's eyes. "I heard about your husband," she said quietly. "Mapleton is small that way. I'm sorry you're going through this." I appreciated that she didn't offer platitudes or judgment. "Thank you. It's been educational." Lily studied me for a moment, then smiled. "How about this? Come in Saturday morning, 7 to 11 now. We'll call it a trial run. You can see if you actually enjoy cafe work, and I can see how you handle the morning rush. No commitment on either side." It was a fair offer. "I'll be here," I promised. As I drove home, I felt a curious blend of terror and exhilaration. Had I really just applied for a part-time job at a coffee shop? At 85? What would Walter say if he knew? What would our friends at the country club think? But that was precisely the point, wasn't it? For the first time in 65 years, Walter's opinion didn't determine my choices. The expectations of our social circle didn't confine my options. I was free to explore, to experiment, to discover, to begin again at 85. The thought should have been daunting. Instead, I found myself smiling as I turned into the driveway of the house that would soon be legally, unquestionably mine. Not because it had been Walter's and I had taken it from him, but because it would be the foundation from which I would launch this unexpected new chapter of my life. Inside, the answering machine was blinking with messages. Robert, wanting to discuss the Mitchell hardware situation. Martha, checking in after the meeting with Walter. Grace, inviting me to lunch at the country club. I didn't return any of the calls immediately. Instead, I went upstairs to the guest bedroom that Walter had used as a home office. The room still held his desk, his bookshelves, his filing cabinets. It had been his exclusive domain during our marriage, his retreat when household noise or demands became too much. Now I stood in the doorway, seeing it with new eyes. The afternoon sun streamed through the bay window, illuminating built-in bookshelves and a window seat I had always envied. The antique desk that had been Walter's pride faced away from the window. He had claimed the view distracted him from work. I crossed to the desk and turned it 180 degrees, positioning it to face the window and the maple tree beyond. There. That was better. One could work and still be connected to the world outside. The shelves would need clearing. Walter's business. Books and mementos would go to him eventually. But I could already envision what would replace them. My neglected collection of novels, photography books, travel guides for places I'd always wanted to visit, but Walter had dismissed as too touristy or too far from business centers. This room would become my study, my retreat, my command center for whatever came next. I sat in Walter's leather chair, my chair now, and swiveled to face the window. Outside, a cardinal landed on a branch of the maple tree, its bright red plumage stark against the gray November sky, a flash of color in an otherwise monochrome scene. Like a woman discovering herself at 85, I thought, after 65 years of marriage. Sometimes the most vibrant chapters come last. Saturday morning arrived with a dusting of snow, the first of the season. I rose at 5:30, an hour earlier than my usual time, oddly nervous about my trial run at the seaside cafe. What does one wear to work as a coffee shop assistant at 85? After deliberating longer than I care to admit, I settled on comfortable slacks, a cashmere sweater, and practical flats. Professional, but not stuffy. Approachable, but not trying to look like someone half my age. The streets of Mapleton were quiet as I drove downtown, most residents still nestled in their beds on a weekend morning. The cafe's windows glowed warmly. In the pre-dawn darkness, a beacon of activity when most of the town slumbered. I parked directly in front and took a deep breath, reminding myself that this was just a trial. 4 hours. I could manage anything for 4 hours. Lily greeted me at the back entrance, her hair pulled into a practical ponytail, already wearing an apron dusted with flour. "Eleanor, right on time. Come in. We've got about 45 minutes before we open, and there's plenty to learn." The next half hour was a whirlwind of information. How to operate the espresso machine, more complex than launching a space shuttle, it seemed. The point-of-sale system, blessedly straightforward, where supplies were kept, and the rhythm of the morning service. "Saturday mornings are our busiest time," Lily explained, showing me how to stack the freshly baked scones in the display case. Young families, people heading to weekend activities, tourists in the warmer months. The rush usually hits around 8:30 and doesn't slow until 11. I absorbed everything with focused attention, determined not to become the elderly novelty worker who couldn't keep up. Precision and organization had been my strengths for decades. Surely those skills would transfer to a new environment. At 7 o'clock, Lily unlocked the front door, and the cafe gradually came to life. Early customers drifted in. Joggers needing caffeine, parents with sleepy children in tow, weekend workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts. I stayed beside Lily at the counter, observing her interactions, how she remembered regular customers' orders, the efficient way she moved between tasks. By 8 o'clock, I was taking simple orders under Lily's supervision, carefully operating the register, and greeting customers with the social ease that had served me well as a business owner's wife. Several Mapleton residents did double takes upon seeing me behind the counter, but most recovered quickly and treated me with the same politeness they'd always shown at charity events or committee meetings. At 8:30, the real rush began. A line formed at the counter, tables filled, and the kitchen sent out a steady stream of breakfast items. I found myself swept into the flow, taking orders, serving pastries, clearing tables, whatever was needed in the moment. There was no time to feel self-conscious or uncertain. The work demanded immediate presence. "Large latte, no foam, extra shot for David," I called, setting the cup on the pickup counter. "Blueberry scone and chamomile. Tea for Lisa." A young couple at the register looked at me curiously. The woman leaned forward and asked, "Is this your first day? I don't remember seeing you here before." "It is," I confirmed with a smile. "Never too late for a new adventure, is it?" By 11 o'clock, when my trial shift ended, I was physically tired but mentally invigorated. The cafe had begun to quiet as the morning crowd dispersed, allowing Lily to join me at a corner table with much-needed cups of coffee. "So," she said, studying me over the rim of her mug, "what did you think? Still interested after experiencing the Saturday morning?" Chaos? I considered the question honestly. My feet ached. My back felt the strain of bending to wipe tables. I'd fumbled with the espresso machine more than once. But I'd also connected with dozens of people, contributed to a smoothly running operation, and experienced a workplace environment utterly different from anything in my previous 8.5 decades. "Surprisingly, yes," I replied. "It's exhausting but satisfying in a way I hadn't anticipated." Lily smiled. "You did well. Better than I expected, to be honest. You have a natural way with customers, and you stayed calm during the rush." "Thank you," I said, warmed by the genuine praise. "Does that mean I've passed the trial?" "With flying colors," Lily confirmed. "If you're still interested, I'd like to offer you the weekend morning shift, Saturdays and Sundays, 7 to 11. We can discuss pay and start date whenever you're ready." I accepted without hesitation, surprising even myself with the immediacy of my decision. We settled on a modest hourly wage, far less than I'd need to live on, but more than enough to give me a sense of earning my own way again, and agreed I would start the following weekend. As I drove home, I realized I hadn't checked my phone all morning. When I did, I found 3 missed calls from Daniel, my attorney. I returned his call immediately. "Mrs. Mitchell," he greeted me, his tone more formal than usual. "I've been trying to reach you. There's been a development in your case." "What's happened?" I asked, suddenly alert. "Mr. Mitchell has filed an emergency motion challenging the validity of the prenuptial agreement," Daniel explained. "He's claiming it should be voided on grounds of unconscionability, essentially arguing that its terms are so one-sided as to be fundamentally unfair by contemporary standards." "Will that work?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. "It's a desperate move," Daniel assured me. "The agreement was properly executed. Both parties had capacity to contract. The terms were clear. The fact that Mr. Mitchell failed to read it carefully is not grounds for voiding a 65-year-old document." "So, we fight it," I said. "Absolutely. We've already prepared our counter-motion. But Mrs. Mitchell, there's something else you should know. Mr. Mitchell has also begun liquidating his personal assets, items that are indisputably his alone." A cold feeling spread through me. "What does that mean for our case?" "It means he's preparing for the possibility that he'll lose," Daniel explained. "Converting physical assets to cash that might be easier to relocate." The implication was clear. Walter was preparing a contingency plan, one that might include moving money beyond the court's reach. "What about the Mitchell hardware?" "Shares?" I asked, dreading the answer. Daniel hesitated. "That's the concerning part. We've received information that Mr. Mitchell has entered preliminary discussions with Kingsley Enterprises about a potential sale of his controlling interest." Kingsley Enterprises, the regional conglomerate that had been trying to acquire Mitchell hardware for years. The company Walter had repeatedly refused to sell to, declaring they would strip the Mitchell name and everything it stands for from the business within 6 months. "He can't do that," I said, my voice rising. "The shares are frozen pending resolution of our case. He's not executing a sale yet. Daniel clarified. Just exploring options. It's a pressure tactic, aimed at forcing you to accept a less favorable settlement to prevent the business from falling into Kingsley's hands. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Walter knew exactly how I felt about Mitchell Hardware. Not just as an asset, but as a legacy for our children and grandchildren. He knew Robert had devoted his career to the company, expecting to eventually step into the leadership role his father had vacated upon retirement. He's using the business as leverage, I said, the realization bitter on my tongue. I'm afraid. So, Daniel agreed. It's a common strategy in high-asset divorces, unfortunately. Threaten something the other party values to gain concessions elsewhere. When I hung up, I sat in my car in the driveway, staring at the house Walter and I had shared for over 6 decades. The home where we'd raised our children, hosted holiday dinners, celebrated milestones, and weathered crises. For the first time since he'd left, I felt not only hurt and angry, but also disillusioned. The man who would threaten our family business, our son's livelihood, our grandchildren's inheritance, to gain advantage in a legal battle was not the man I thought I'd married. Or perhaps he was, and I'd simply never seen this side of him because our interests had always been aligned. Perhaps the Walter who would leverage Mitchell Hardware as a bargaining chip had always existed beneath the surface of the devoted husband and father I believed I knew. The thought was more painful than his leaving had been. Inside the house, I found a message from Robert on the answering machine, his voice tense. "Mom, call me as soon as you can. It's about Dad and the business." I dialed his number, preparing myself for a difficult conversation. "Mom," Robert answered immediately, strain evident in his voice. "Have you heard? About Dad talking to Kingsley?" "Daniel just told me," I confirmed. "Robert, I want you to know I had nothing to do with this. I would never want the business sold outside the family." "I know that," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But Dad is serious. He met with James Kingsley yesterday. Patricia and I were blindsided. We only found out when the accounting department was asked to prepare financial summaries for potential buyers." My heart ached for my son. "What did your father say when you confronted him?" Robert's laugh was hollow. "That business is business. That if he can't retain control of his company, he'd rather sell it to the highest bidder than watch it become a pawn in a divorce settlement." His voice cracked slightly. He said, and I quote, "If your mother wants war, she'll get one." The words stung, but more for Robert's sake than my own. Walter was punishing our children to get to me. "What can I do?" I asked. "I don't know," Robert admitted, sounding more defeated than I'd ever heard him. "Dad holds the controlling interest. If he's determined to sell, there's not much anyone can do to stop him." After we hung up, I paced the living room, anger building with each step. This was beyond a dispute between Walter and me. This was Walter deliberately threatening something our entire family valued, something he claimed to value himself. I picked up the phone and did something I hadn't done since the day Walter left. I called him directly. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice wary. "Eleanor? Leave Mitchell Hardware out of this," I said without preamble. "The business has nothing to do with our marriage or its dissolution." Walter's tone hardened. "The business has everything to do with our marriage. I built it while we were married. It's a marital asset like any other." "You know that's not true," I countered. "Mitchell Hardware is more than an asset. It's Robert's career. It's part of our grandchildren's future. It's your legacy, Walter." "A legacy I built," he said sharply. "If I can't protect it my way, then perhaps it's better in Kingsley's hands. At least I'll get fair market value." "Is that what Judith thinks too?" I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "That selling the business you spent a lifetime building is a reasonable response to a legal setback?" Walter's silence told me I'd struck a nerve. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. Judith doesn't understand the business world. She thinks I should simply give you what you want and be done with it. An unexpected ally in Judith. The irony might have been amusing under different circumstances. Then why are you pursuing this course? I pressed. Because I will not be stripped of everything at 87, Walter replied, heat returning to his voice. I built something from nothing, Ellie. Yes, you supported me. Yes, you managed our home and raised our children. I've never diminished that contribution. But Mitchell Hardware exists because of my vision, my risk, my 60-hour weeks for decades. And now you'd destroy it out of spite, I said softly. Not spite, Walter corrected. Self-preservation. You leave me no choice with your insistence on enforcing that prenup to the letter. I took a deep breath. There's always a choice. Walter, you chose to leave our marriage. You chose to empty our accounts. You're choosing now to threaten our family business rather than accept the consequences of your actions. Save the moral high ground for someone who hasn't known you for 65 years, Walter snapped. You're enjoying this. The chance to finally control everything, to show everyone that perfect, proper Eleanor Mitchell isn't to be crossed. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Was there truth in it? Was I pursuing the prenuptial enforcement out of a desire for control? For vengeance? I want what I'm legally entitled to, I said finally. No more, no less. Then you'll get exactly what you've asked for, Walter replied, his voice cold. The prenup enforcement process will take months. By then, Mitchell Hardware will belong to Kingsley Enterprises, and your victory will taste like ashes. He hung up, leaving me holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone. I replaced it slowly, my thoughts churning. Walter was right about one thing. The legal process would take time. Too much time to save the business if he was determined to sell. I needed to find another way. That evening, I sat at Walter's desk, my desk now, in what was becoming my study. I'd cleared one bookshelf already, replacing his business manuals with my own eclectic collection of novels, poetry, and art books. The room was slowly transforming, becoming a reflection of Eleanor rather than Walter. On the desk before me lay printouts of the Mitchell Hardware Articles of Incorporation, bylaws, and shareholder agreements that Daniel had provided. I'd been reviewing them for hours, looking for anything that might prevent Walter from selling to Kingsley. The controlling. Shares had originally been divided between Walter and my father, who had provided the initial capital investment. Upon my father's death, his shares had transferred to me, and I had gifted them to Walter as a 25th anniversary present. A gesture of trust and partnership that now seemed naively romantic. The door chimed, pulling me from my research. I wasn't expecting visitors, especially so late in the evening. When I opened the door, I found Patricia on the porch, her expression grim. "Mom," she said without preamble, "we need to talk about Mitchell Hardware." I invited her in, leading her to the kitchen where I put on the kettle for tea. Patricia perched on a stool at the counter, her posture tense. "Robert told me about your conversation with Dad," she said. "About the Kingsley threat." I nodded, setting out cups and saucers. "Your father is using the business as leverage in our legal dispute." Patricia's eyes flashed with the same determination I'd seen since she was a small girl facing down playground bullies. "It's more than leverage, Mom. He's submitted formal notice to the board that he intends to entertain purchase offers. This isn't a bluff." The kettle whistled, giving me a moment to absorb this. I poured water over tea bags, focusing on the simple task to steady my hands. "What does the board say?" I asked, setting a cup in front of Patricia. "They're divided," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Some think it's a reasonable business decision given Kingsley's generous offer. Others believe the Mitchell name and family ownership are integral to the company's identity." "And Robert?" Patricia's expression softened. "He's devastated. This company has been his whole life since college. He always expected to take over completely when Dad stepped down. I stirred honey into my tea, considering options. Patricia, what if there was a way to keep the company in the family, regardless of how my legal situation with your father resolves? She looked up sharply. What do you mean? I chose my words carefully. I've been reviewing the corporate documents. There may be options we haven't considered. Like what? Patricia pressed. I need more time to research, I hedged, not wanting to share half-formed ideas. But I want you and Robert to know I'm committed to finding a solution that protects Mitchell Hardware, regardless of what happens between your father and me. Patricia studied me for a long moment. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I nodded, sensing her intensity. This prenuptial agreement that's causing so much trouble, is it really worth destroying our family over? Couldn't you and Dad reach some reasonable compromise? The question pierced my carefully maintained composure. Is that what you think I'm doing? Destroying our family? Patricia sighed, pushing a hand through her hair. No, that's not fair. Dad started this by leaving. But now it's escalated into something that affects all of us, not just you and him. The business, the family name, relationships between all of us, everything's at stake. She wasn't wrong. What had begun as a personal betrayal was spiraling outward, threatening to damage connections that had nothing to do with Walter's and my marriage. I understand your concern, I said carefully, but compromising now, after your father has deliberately escalated the situation by threatening the business, feels like rewarding bullying tactics. Even if standing firm means losing Mitchell Hardware? Patricia challenged. I set down my teacup. That's exactly what I'm trying to prevent. After Patricia left, promising to keep our conversation between us for now, I returned to my study and the stack of legal documents. There had to be a solution. Something that would protect the business without capitulating to Walter's demands. I worked late into the night, making notes, cross-referencing articles and bylaws. Around midnight, my eyes fell on a clause I'd overlooked previously, tucked into an amendment made nearly 30 years ago when Mitchell Hardware had expanded beyond Massachusetts. I read it 3 times to be sure I understood its implications. Then I reached for the phone and called Daniel, despite the late hour. He answered groggily but became fully alert when I explained what I'd found. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, the excitement evident in his voice. This could change everything. I'll need to verify some details, but if this clause means what we think, it does. How quickly can you move on this? I asked. I'll start first thing tomorrow, he promised. But Mrs. Mitchell, you should be prepared. If we pursue this course, it will almost certainly destroy any possibility of an amicable resolution with Mr. Mitchell. I thought about Walter's threat to sell to Kingsley, his willingness to sacrifice our son's career and our family legacy for tactical advantage. I think we're well beyond amicable, Daniel, I replied. Let's proceed. Sunday morning, I went to my trial shift at the Seaside Cafe as planned, finding unexpected solace in the straightforward tasks of serving customers and learning the coffee preparation process. For 4 hours, I could focus on something other than prenuptial agreements and corporate bylaws. Lily noticed my distraction despite my efforts to stay present. Everything okay? She asked during a rare lull. You seem a million miles away today. Just some family complications, I said with a smile that felt forced. Nothing a few dozen lattes can't help me forget temporarily. She didn't press, but her concern was evident. If you need to talk, I'm a pretty good listener. Comes with the barista territory. I thanked her and returned to wiping down tables, touched by the offer from someone who had been a stranger just days ago. The world I was discovering contained kindness in unexpected places. By the time I returned home, there was a message from Daniel asking me to call him immediately. I did, my heart racing. I've reviewed everything, he said without preamble. The clause is valid and enforceable. We can proceed whenever you're ready. What's our timeline? I asked. I can file the necessary paperwork tomorrow morning, Daniel replied. Then it's just a matter of waiting for the judge to review and rule. Given the circumstances, I've requested expedited consideration. I took a deep breath. Do it. And Daniel. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he cautioned. This is just the beginning of what might be a very contentious process. After hanging up, I sat in my study, staring at the garden now dusted with snow. The decision I'd just authorized would change everything, not just between Walter and me, but potentially within our entire family. Once this particular die was cast, there would be no way to retrieve it. But Walter had left me no choice. He had escalated a private marital dispute into a threat against our family's legacy. In doing so, he had forced my hand. The next morning, I rose early and dressed with particular care, a tailored navy suit I usually reserved for special occasions, my strand of pearls, subtle makeup. Armor for the battle ahead. At 9 o'clock, I arrived at Mitchell Hardware headquarters, a modest but elegant 4-story building in downtown Mapleton. The receptionist's eyes widened in surprise when I entered. Mrs. Mitchell, we weren't expecting you today. I need to see my son, I replied pleasantly. Is Robert available? She hesitated, clearly uncertain about protocol for the founder's estranged wife appearing unannounced. He's in a meeting with the executive team right now. Should I let him know you're here? Please don't interrupt, I said. I'll wait in his office if that's all right. Still flustered, she nodded. Of course, Mrs. Mitchell. You know the way. I walked the familiar corridors to Robert's corner office on the 3rd floor. The walls were lined with photographs chronicling Mitchell Hardware's history, the original store opening, each subsequent expansion, award ceremonies, community events. Walter featured prominently in most of them, and I appeared in many as well, the supportive wife standing proudly beside her successful husband. Robert's assistant jumped up when I entered the outer office. Mrs. Mitchell, Robert didn't mention you were coming by today. It was a spontaneous decision, I explained. I won't disturb his meeting. I'll just wait in his office, if that's acceptable. Of course, she said, opening the door for me. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water? I declined politely and settled into one of the visitor chairs facing Robert's desk. The office reflected my son's personality. Methodical, traditional, with attention to detail. Family photographs occupied one corner of his desk. His wife, their grown children, a recent snapshot of their first grandchild, the achievements and connections that truly mattered. I waited nearly 40 minutes before Robert appeared, surprise evident on his face. Mom, what are you doing here? I rose to embrace him. I needed to see you. Something important has happened. Robert closed the door, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. What is it? Is this about Dad and Kingsley? Indirectly, I said, resuming my seat. Robert, I've authorized my attorney to take a legal action that will affect Mitchell Hardware. I wanted you to hear it from me directly. His brow furrowed. What kind of legal action? I took a deep breath. I'm exercising the Family Protection Clause in the 1992 Corporate Amendment. Robert stared at me blankly. The what? It's a provision your father insisted upon when the company expanded. Beyond Massachusetts, I explained. It states that in the event of a sale to a non-family entity, surviving family members have right of first refusal at a 10% discount from any offered price. Understanding dawned in Robert's eyes, but that was designed to protect the company if Dad died unexpectedly, not for. The language doesn't limit it to death scenarios, I said gently. It applies to any potential sale to non-family entities. Robert sank into his chair. So if Dad tries to sell to Kingsley, You, Patricia, and I have the right to match their offer, minus 10%, I confirmed. Furthermore, we have 60 days to arrange financing once we invoke the clause. Mom, Robert said slowly, Kingsley is offering nearly $80 million. None of us has that kind of money, even with the discount. I smiled. No, but collectively we might have enough for a leveraged buyout with the right investment. Partners. Daniel is already exploring options with several financial institutions that specialize in family business transitions. Robert looked stunned. You've been planning this? For how long? Since I learned your father was talking to Kingsley, I admitted. Robert, I won't let him destroy what you've helped build just to punish me. My son's expression was unreadable. Have you told Dad about this? Not yet, I said. The legal papers will be filed this morning. He'll be notified officially, as will the board. Robert stood and walked to the window overlooking downtown Mapleton. I could see tension in every line of his body as he processed what I'd told him. He'll see this as a declaration of war, he said finally. Coming from you, using his own legal clause against him. He'll never forgive this. The assessment stung, but I couldn't deny its accuracy. I know, but I couldn't see another way to protect the business. Robert turned to face me. What happens if we actually succeed? If we find the financing and buy Dad out? Where does that leave him? It was the question I'd been wrestling with since discovering the clause. He would receive fair market value for his shares, minus the 10% discount. It's still a substantial sum, more than enough for him to live comfortably for whatever years remain to him. But he would lose control of the company he founded, Robert said, his voice tight. The company that bears his name. Yes, I acknowledged. That would be the consequence of his choice to threaten the business in our divorce proceedings. Robert shook his head slowly. Mom, I don't know if I can support this. He's still my father, despite everything. I rose and crossed to him, taking his hands in mine. I understand. But Robert, ask yourself this. If your father sells to Kingsley, what happens to your career? To the legacy you've helped build? To the future you've planned for your children and grandchildren in this company? Conflict played across his features. I don't know what to do. You don't have to decide right now, I assured him. The filing will happen regardless. You'll have time to consider your position before any actual buyout would occur. As I left Mitchell Hardware headquarters, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Determination, yes. Satisfaction at having found a potential solution, certainly. But also a profound sadness that it had come to this, using legal maneuverings against the man I had loved for 65 years. That afternoon, my phone rang incessantly. First Daniel, confirming the paperwork had been filed. Then Patricia, alternately concerned and impressed by the strategy. Grace, who had heard whispers of something big happening at Mitchell Hardware. Martha, offering her unequivocal support. I let most calls go to the answering machine, needing time to prepare for the one call I knew would eventually come. When it did, just after 5 o'clock, Walter didn't bother with pleasantries. The family protection clause? He said, his voice vibrating with barely controlled fury. That's your play, Eleanor? Using my own corporate safeguard against me? It seems appropriate, I replied, keeping my voice level. You created that clause to protect the business from outside threats. That's exactly how I'm using it now. I am not an outside threat, Walter snapped. I built that company. My name is on the building, for God's sake. And yet you were willing to sell it to Kingsley to gain leverage in our divorce, I pointed out. How is that protecting your legacy? Walter's breath came harshly through the line. You've crossed a line, Ellie. This isn't just about our marriage anymore. This is sabotage. No, Walter, I corrected. This is consequences. You escalated our private dispute by threatening the business. I found a way to protect it, that's all. Protected it? he repeated incredulously. You've created total chaos. The board is in an uproar. Robert is caught in an impossible position. And for what? To prove you can beat me at my own game? The accusation echoed his earlier one, that I was pursuing this out of some desire for control or vengeance. But it wasn't true, or at least not entirely true. I did this because it was necessary, I said firmly. Because you left me no alternative when you decided to use Mitchell Hardware as a bargaining chip. There were always alternatives, Walter countered. Reasonable settlement discussions, mediation, compromise. You rejected them all in favor of this corporate coup. His characterization stung because it contained a kernel of truth. I had rejected compromise, had insisted on enforcing the prenuptial agreement to the letter. Had I been too rigid? Too focused on principle at the expense of practical resolution? Perhaps, I conceded. But your threat to sell to Kingsley eliminated any middle ground. You forced this outcome, Walter, not me. The silence that followed was heavy with 65 years of shared history, now fractured beyond recognition. What happens now? Walter finally asked, his voice suddenly sounding every one of his 87 years. The legal process continues, I said. Both the prenuptial enforcement and the family protection clause invocation. Unless what? Walter prompted when I didn't immediately continue. I hesitated, then plunged ahead. Unless we find another solution. One that protects the business for the family while providing for both of us appropriately. Walter laughed bitterly. Now you want to negotiate? After filing legal paperwork that undermines my position entirely? I want to resolve this, Walter, I said honestly, in a way that doesn't destroy everything we both value. There was a long pause. I'll have Andrew call Daniel, Walter said finally. But Ellie, don't mistake this for surrender. You've won this skirmish, but the war is far from over. War. Such a terrible word for what our 65-year marriage had become. After Walter hung up, I stood alone in my kitchen, wondering if I had just achieved a strategic victory or made an irrevocable mistake. The family protection clause provided a path to saving Mitchell Hardware from Kingsley, yes, but at what cost to the already strained relationships within our family? The doorbell interrupted my thoughts. When I opened it, I found Robert on the porch, his expression troubled. May I come in? He asked formally, as if he were a visitor rather than the son who had grown up in this house. I stepped aside, heart heavy at the distance between us. Of course. Robert entered but remained standing in the foyer, too agitated to sit. I just came from Dad's condo. He's furious about the legal filing. I imagine he is, I said, leading the way to the living room despite Robert's reluctance to move further into the house. I spoke with him briefly. Mom, Robert said, finally sitting on the edge of the sofa, do you understand what you've done? The position you've put me in? I sat across from him. I understand it's complicated. You're caught between your parents in a situation neither of you created. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it, Robert replied, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so like his father's that my heart contracted. Dad thinks I knew about this, that I helped you plan it. Did you tell him you didn't? I asked. Of course, Robert said. But he's not in a rational place right now. He feels betrayed. By you, by me, by the company itself. I leaned forward. Robert, I'm sorry you're in this position, but I couldn't stand by and watch your father dismantle everything you've worked for just to gain advantage in our divorce. So instead, you're doing exactly what he threatened to do, forcing a change in company ownership, Robert pointed out. How is that protecting what I've worked for? The question hit its mark. The difference, I said carefully, is that your father was willing to sell to Kingsley, who would dismantle the Mitchell identity. I'm trying to keep ownership within the family. By using a legal maneuver Dad created decades ago, Robert said, his tone making clear how he viewed the irony. You realize this could permanently destroy any chance of reconciliation between you two? I hadn't allowed myself to consider reconciliation as a possibility since the day Walter left. The thought that my actions might eliminate even the theoretical possibility created an unexpected pang. Do you think reconciliation was likely before this? I asked softly. Robert sighed, deflating slightly. No, not with Judith in the picture. He met my gaze directly. But Mom, this isn't just about you and Dad anymore. This is about the future of Mitchell Hardware, about my career, my children's inheritance, everything we've all built together. That's exactly why I acted, I insisted, to protect those things. But what if your protection tears the company apart from within? Robert challenged. The board is divided. Management is confused. Employees are worried. And now the two most important people in the company's history are engaged in open warfare. Put that way, I could see how my legal strategy, however well-intentioned, might create its own set of problems for Mitchell Hardware, problems potentially as damaging as a sale to Kingsley. What would you have me do? I asked honestly. Let your father sell to Kingsley without opposition? Robert was quiet for a moment, considering. No, but perhaps there's a third option we haven't explored. Something that preserves the company without putting you and Dad at eternal odds. I'm listening, I said. I need time to work it out, Robert replied, standing. But Mom, please, don't take any further legal steps until I've had a chance to find another path forward. For all our sakes. After he left, I sat alone in the gathering dusk, wondering what solution Robert might envision that neither Walter nor I had considered. Whatever it was, I hoped it would come quickly. The legal wheels were already in motion, and time was running short. That night, I slept fitfully, dreams filled with boardrooms and courthouses, prenuptial agreements and corporate bylaws. I awoke before dawn, exhausted but too restless to remain in bed. Hi, Part 5. The Transformed Reality. 3 days later, I sat in the conference room at Harrington and Associates, surrounded by legal documents spread across the polished oak table. Daniel stood at the whiteboard, mapping out the complex series of events that would unfold if we proceeded with both the prenuptial enforcement and the Family Protection Clause invocation. The timeline stretched across months, with multiple decision points and potential outcomes branching in different directions. As you can see, Mrs. Mitchell, Daniel concluded, capping his marker, we're positioned strongly on both fronts. The prenuptial agreement should stand up to Mr. Mitchell's challenge, and the Family Protection Clause gives us significant leverage regarding the business. I studied the whiteboard, the legal strategy laid out in Daniel's precise handwriting. It was thorough, strategic, and virtually guaranteed to secure my financial future. It would also likely destroy any possibility of healing within our family. What happens to Walter if we win on all counts? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Daniel hesitated. He would retain his personal possessions and whatever funds he's managed to set aside in accounts solely in his name. Beyond that, he shrugged. Not much. At 87, I mused aloud, starting over with essentially nothing. Mrs. Mitchell, Daniel said carefully, with all due respect, that outcome is the direct result of Mr. Mitchell's own choices. He signed the prenuptial agreement. He chose to leave the marriage. He threatened to sell Mitchell Hardware to an outside entity. These consequences were foreseeable had he bothered to investigate fully before acting. Everything Daniel said was objectively true. Walter had made his choices with eyes wide open, or at least they should have been. And yet, the prospect of leaving him with nothing at 87, regardless of his actions, sat uneasily in my conscience. There's something else you should know, Daniel added, checking his watch. Robert Mitchell has requested a meeting with both you and Mr. Mitchell this afternoon, at the Mitchell Hardware headquarters. My eyebrows rose in surprise. Did he say why? Only that he has a proposal that might resolve both the prenuptial dispute and the business ownership question, Daniel replied. He was quite insistent that both you and Mr. Mitchell attend, along with your respective counsel. I thought of Robert's promise to find a third option, a path neither Walter nor I had considered. Apparently, he believed he had found it. I'll be there, I decided. Whatever Robert has in mind, I owe him the courtesy of listening. The Mitchell Hardware conference room felt smaller than I remembered, perhaps because of the emotional weight of the gathering. Walter sat at one end of the table, Andrew Covington beside him. I took the opposite end, Daniel at my right. Robert occupied the center position, a stack of folders before him, his expression unreadable. Thank you all for coming, Robert began, his professional demeanor firmly in place despite the personal nature of the meeting. As you know, the current situation threatens both my parents' financial well-being and the future of Mitchell Hardware. After considerable thought, I believe I've found a solution that addresses all parties' core concerns. He distributed folders to each of us. Please review these documents before I continue. I opened my folder to find a complex organizational chart for what appeared to be a corporate restructuring, followed by financial projections and legal terms. Across the table, Walter frowned as he studied the same materials. What exactly am I looking at, Robert? Walter asked. A new organizational structure for Mitchell Hardware, Robert explained. One that would transfer your controlling interest to a family trust rather than to any individual. Daniel leaned forward. A trust? With what terms? Robert nodded toward the documents. Page 3 outlines the basic framework. The Mitchell Family Trust would hold controlling interest in the company. Walter and Eleanor would serve as lifetime beneficiaries, receiving equal income from the trust. Upon their deaths, the benefits would transfer to a broader family group, their children, grandchildren, and future descendants. I flipped to page 3, scanning the outlined terms. And governance? Who would control business decisions? A board of trustees, Robert replied. 5 members, Walter, Eleanor, myself, Patricia, and an independent trustee with business experience, selected by mutual agreement. Walter scoffed. So I'd lose control of my company and be outvoted on every decision? Not necessarily, Robert countered. The trust agreement would require supermajority approval, 4 of 5 trustees, for major decisions like mergers, acquisitions, or sales of significant assets. Day-to-day operations would continue under professional management, which I would oversee as CEO. Andrew Covington studied the documents with narrowed eyes. This effectively removes the company from the divorce proceedings entirely. It's no longer a marital asset to be divided, but a separate entity that benefits both parties. Exactly, Robert confirmed. Neither party could sell their interest, or remove the other from the benefit structure. Daniel leaned toward me. Mrs. Mitchell, this arrangement would provide you with ongoing income from the business, but would supersede the prenuptial agreement's provisions regarding Mitchell Hardware. Shares specifically, I considered the implications. And other assets? The house? Investments? Retirement accounts? Those would still be subject to the prenuptial agreement's terms, Robert explained. This proposal only addresses Mitchell Hardware specifically. Walter closed his folder with a decisive snap. Why would I agree to this? I'd be surrendering control of my life's work. Robert met his father's gaze steadily. Because the alternative is worse, Dad. If you proceed with selling to Kingsley, we'll invoke the family protection clause. If Mom proceeds with full prenuptial enforcement, you'll lose ownership anyway. His voice softened. This way, your legacy remains intact. The Mitchell name stays on the business. Your grandchildren and their children will benefit from what you built, and you'll have ongoing income and involvement for the rest of your life. The room fell silent as Walter absorbed his son's words. I watched emotions play across his face: anger, resentment, calculation, and finally, a reluctant recognition. "And you, Ellie?" Walter asked, turning to me. "Would you accept this compromise?" All eyes turned to me. I took a moment to consider the proposal carefully. It would provide financial security without destroying the business our family had built. It would give Robert the leadership role he had earned through decades of dedicated work. It would ensure our grandchildren's future connection to their heritage. It would also require me to yield on full enforcement of the prenuptial agreement, at least regarding the business. To accept less than what I was legally entitled to. "I have one condition," I said finally. "The independent trustee must be someone with specific expertise in family business governance. Someone truly neutral, not connected to either Walter or me through friendship or business relationships." Robert nodded. "That's reasonable. We could establish criteria for selection in the trust documents." "Then yes," I decided. "I can accept this framework, pending review of the final trust documents." Walter studied me from across the table, surprise evident in his expression. "Just like that? You're willing to compromise?" "This isn't about winning, Walter," I replied, quietly. "It's about finding a solution that serves everyone's interests, especially our children's and grandchildren's. Robert has created a path that does that." Something shifted in Walter's eyes. A grudging respect, perhaps. Or simply the recognition that his options were limited. "I'll need time to review the details with Andrew," he said finally, "but conceptually, it has merit." Robert's relief was palpable. "Thank you both. I'll have the full documentation prepared for review within the week." As the meeting concluded, Walter approached me while our attorneys conferred in the corner. "You surprised me today, Ellie." "How so?" I asked. "You were always the practical one," he admitted. "I expected you to fight to the bitter end on principle." I thought about my journey over the past months, from devastated wife to emerging self, from seeking justice to seeking peace. Perhaps I've learned that some principles matter more than others. Preserving our family's future seems more important than punishing past mistakes. Walter studied me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I regret how this unfolded. Not just the legal battles, but everything." The qualified apology hung between us, insufficient yet somehow significant. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "It doesn't change our path forward, but it helps clear some of the debris from the path behind." 3. Months later, I stood at the window of my study, truly mine now, with Walter's books and mementos long since removed. Outside, spring was asserting itself in the garden, crocuses pushing through the last patches of snow, promising renewal after the long winter. The Mitchell Family Trust had been established, the paperwork finalized after weeks of negotiation, over specific terms. Walter and I had each received significant lump sum distributions from the company before the transfer, providing us with independent financial security. The remaining assets, primarily the house and various investment accounts, had been divided according to a modified version of the prenuptial agreement, one that acknowledged Walter's need for housing and basic living expenses while preserving most of my rights under the original document. It wasn't the outcome either of us had initially sought. Walter had wanted to walk away with half of everything and full control of Mitchell Hardware. I had wanted the prenuptial agreement enforced to the letter, granting me virtually everything. We had each compromised, yielding on some points while standing firm on others. The doorbell chimed, pulling me from my reflections. I opened it to find Lily from the Seaside Cafe on my porch, holding a wicker basket. "Hope I'm not disturbing you," she said with her characteristic warmth. "I brought some of those scones you like, and I wanted to check if we're still on for tomorrow's book club meeting." I invited her in, touched by the thoughtful gesture. My weekend shifts at the cafe had evolved into a genuine friendship with Lily, one entirely separate from my identity as Walter Mitchell's wife or even as the mother of Robert and Patricia. With Lily, I was simply Eleanor, book lover, coffee, enthusiast, occasional baker of spectacular almond croissants. "Thank you for these," I said, setting the basket on the kitchen counter. "And yes, absolutely for tomorrow's meeting. I've finished the novel and have thoughts." Lily laughed. "You always have thoughts. That's why the group loves having you." As we chatted over tea, I marveled at how much my life had transformed in the 6 months since Walter's departure. What had begun as the most painful chapter of my life had somehow led to unexpected growth, new connections, and a clearer sense of self than I'd possessed in decades. I still saw Walter occasionally, at Mitchell Hardware board meetings, family gatherings with the grandchildren, the rare social event we both attended. We were cordial, our interactions shaped by 65 years of shared history, but tempered by the knowledge that we were now on separate paths. He and Judith had married in a small ceremony. I had sent a civil note, but declined to attend. "You seem contemplative today," Lily observed, interrupting my thoughts. "Everything okay?" I smiled, appreciating her perception. "Just reflecting on the journey of the past few months. If someone had told me last year that Walter would leave and I would end up working in a cafe, joining a book club, and negotiating a complex business restructuring, I would have thought they were delusional. Life rarely follows the scripts. We write for it," Lily agreed, "but sometimes the revised versions turn out better than the originals." After Lily left, I returned to my study and opened my laptop, another new development in my life. At 85, I had finally embraced technology, taking a computer class at the community center and discovering the liberation of email, online research, and video calls with distant friends. I opened a document I'd been working on for several weeks, a memoir of sorts, though not the kind I would ever publish. This was a private accounting of my journey, from devoted wife to abandoned spouse to independent woman. Writing it had become a form of therapy, a way to process the grief, anger, and ultimately, the unexpected liberation of this late-life transition. Today I would add another entry, marking the final resolution of the legal matters that had consumed so much energy. But I would also note the more significant milestone, the realization that I was no longer defined by my marriage to Walter or its dissolution. At 85, I had discovered that identity isn't fixed. That strength comes in, forms beyond endurance. That independence, once feared, could become the foundation for a life more authentic than the one I had lived for 65 years as Walter's wife. The prenuptial agreement that had seemed so central to my future had ultimately become just one element in a more complex resolution. Important, yes, but not the defining factor in my new reality. What mattered more was the discovery that Eleanor Mitchell, just Eleanor, was more than enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.